Gdvach, Shvua Tov. This is the moment we've been waiting for, the opportunity to ask any question to the Rav. It could be on any topic. It could be chinuch, parnasa, family, medical. This is an opportunity to ask all questions that one may have. We're first going to start with the questions that were submitted previously via the website, and then from there, time permitting, we're going to go around and go at questions from the podium, from the public. The first question that came in is from a doctor. I've been doing daf yomi for over 25 years. I've been practicing medicine for 30. And every time I come to the Mishnah, Toiv sheberoifim legehenim, I get nervous. What advice can the Rav give?
You don't have to be a doctor to get nervous when you learn Toiv sheberoifim legehenim. I think everyone gets nervous when he learns this mama. So let me respond and explain. First of all, we need to know the nature of the Gemara. So the Talmud is a compilation of many, many different opinions. And anybody familiar with the Gemara knows that sometimes Chazal express themselves in very extreme terms. And the Gemara clearly states in a few different sources that guzma is a legitimate way of one to express himself. So in my writings and my tshuvas, I pointed out that there is a machlokes between the Rambam and the Rashba whether the klolei apsak, the fundamental rules, when there is disagreement between one great Tana and another, or one Amoira and another, do we have fixed rules, halachic kaman? Does this refer only to halachic discussions, or also when we're dealing with Agadata or Chasidus? So, Toiv sheberoifim legehenim. There's another Mama Chazal. Ama oretz mutar lekoroi kedag b'yoyim kippurim shechal liyas b'Shabbos. I think that is far more extreme. And Ama oretz, you could tear him up like you tear a fish on Yom Kippur shechal liyas b'Shabbos. These statements should definitely not be taken literally, but they do express a certain sentiment and a certain approach. So regarding Toiv sheberoifim legehenim. On the other hand, there's a Gemara in Hidachov Weiss, one of the greatest Tanoim, had a shaila. V'nishal ha'chachomim, v'chachomim nishalu l'roifim. There are so many different sources in Gemara that the greatest of our sages consulted doctors. So there are different interpretations. One of them is Toiv sheberoifim. The doctors that think they are the best, they are a very dangerous breed. Because people that make decisions that affect the lives of others need to be humble. And the more experience you carry, the more humility is necessary. And that goes for Rabbonim and it goes for doctors. So in my life, I have seen so many doctors. And the vast majority of the ones that I know and the ones I came to meet were unbelievable people of caring, of compassion, of humility. But when doctors are arrogant, they could be very bad. Because arrogant people aren't willing to listen to others. Arrogant people sometimes make decisions which are not clearly thought through. So some say that the emphasis of this Ma'amar Chazal is Toiv sheberoifim. Those doctors that think they're the best, they're the greatest, they know everything, and they are apt to come to Gehenna by making the wrong decisions and by not being thorough enough or humble enough to consult, to listen, to study when their decisions are decisions of life and death. Of all the different interpretations I have come across, this is the one that appeals to me the most, and it stresses the sheer necessity of doctors to have a large degree of humility, of humbleness, and know, I don't know everything, and I still have to learn. And the greater responsibility, the more humility is required. And that is why the Torah says, V'hu ish Moshe onav ma'oid mekol adam asher al pnei ha'adama. Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest individual ever to walk the face of earth. He was number one, and he was the most humble person of all. So greatness necessitates humbleness. The greater you are, the more humble you are expected to be, and the more humble you need to be. So of all the different pshotim, all the different interpretations, the one that appeals to most to me is the emphasis on toiv sheberoifim. The top, the best, and those doctors that think nobody compares to me, those are the ones that might make the gravest mistakes. That's the best I could do to calm your nervousness.
Our next question comes from Uwe Scheinfeld. How should one view medical instruction of the Gemara when it goes against current medical science? For example, eating fish and meat together. Was it merely based on the doctors of those days, or is it part of Torah Shel Peh that applies even going against current medical knowledge?
So there's a Tosfos in Moed Katan Daf Yud Aleph, and Tosfos clearly says we do not rely on medical advice that we find in the Gemara. And it is not clear in Tosfos why not. There are two different interpretations. But what is important is that Tosfos addresses this question in Moed Katan Daf Yud Aleph. The Gemara says when fish become decomposed, the very last stage before they rot, before they become decomposed, they are the best and the healthiest. And that's what the Gemara says. And Tosfos says we should not rely on any medical advice given in the Gemara. And there are two different interpretations. One interpretation is maybe things have changed throughout the ages. And this is a very broad discussion, which is not for a Q&A session. This necessitates a sheer, a discussion of an hour. When do we say things have changed? We find this in the Rishonim in a few different sources. And when is it unreasonable to say things in biology have changed? So one approach explaining the Tosfos is things have changed. And the other approach is whenever we deal with medicine, it is not an essential part of Torah Shebal Peh. And Chazal had the best and most advanced medicine of their time. But medicine or similarly related sugyas are not part of Messiah, are not part of Torah Shebal Peh. And therefore, when medical medicine advances, we follow instructions of current medical opinions. This is a fundamental answer based on Tosfos. But there must be more detailed answers. So many times we find in the Gemara halachic ruling, and we could explain why it's no longer relevant. And I'll give two examples. Makashel cholol. The Gemara says, any ailment that is within your body, internal, not external, is defined as a chole sheyesh b'sekona, and it permits chilul Shabbos. Because 2,000 years ago, doctors knew very little about what's happening inside your body. How could they know? They had no instruments, no tools, no x-rays, no MRI, no CT, nothing. And that is why Ibn Ezra writes, almost 1,000 years ago, doctors know only about external ailments, nothing internal. According to Ibn Ezra, doctors are authorized only to treat a skin rash, nothing else, no internal medicine. Only dermatologists are allowed in a frum society, no other doctor. And it is surprising that the Agudas Ezov, who was a Godel B'Yesod, he was the father of the Avnei Nezer, And he writes in a tshuva, well, Ibn Ezra already taught us. Doctors know nothing about internal medicine. He wasn't aware that 800 years transpired since the Ibn Ezra already wrote, and this was written about 130 years ago. But comparing what doctors knew 130 years ago and what they know today, probably these 100 years have advanced medicine far more than the 700 years between Ibn Ezra and the Agudas Eizov. So when the Gemara says, and it's quoted in the Shulchan Aruch 500 years ago, any internal ailment permits Chilul Shabbos, that is no longer relevant today. Gav Hayad, if you have a wound on the back of your hand, that necessitates Chilul Shabbos, it permits Chilul Shabbos. If we have a cut on our hand, we're not Mechalel Shabbos. We put some disinfectant and we put a bandage and we're going to be fine. So in days of yore, people didn't know what causes infection. They knew nothing about bacteria, about germs, and there are blood vessels very close to your skin on the back of your hand, like on the side of your wrist. People got a cut. They weren't aware of tetanus. People died. So Chazal said, this must be treated immediately, even necessitating Chilul Shabbos. But today, when our Makkah Shel Barzel, the Gemara says Makkah Shel Barzel necessitates, permits Chilul Shabbos, because rusty metal, and usually tetanus is if it's not exposed to the air or to the sun, it breathes. So people got a cut from a knife and they died. So today we can understand why Chazal assumed these halachas, and they're no longer relevant today, so we follow today's medicine. On the other hand, mitzitza. So medical experts don't know, why is mitzitza important? But we have no way to explain why Chazal thought it is a lifesaver, and things have changed. And therefore, we forever follow Chazal. When we don't have a reasonable explanation why things have changed, we follow Chazal. But when we have a reasonable explanation, 3 examples I gave, Makkah Shel Barzel, Gava Yad, Makkah Shel Cholol. We could understand why they, in their day and age, this was a sakana, but no longer. In those cases, we follow present-day protocol. But when Chazal say mitzitza is essential to your health, and the baby is in a sakana without mitzitza, and we have no way to explain why they thought so, Divrei Chazal reign supreme, and we follow Chazal. So I think I gave somewhat of a complex answer. First of all, following medicine, Tosfos Amayit says, we don't follow remedies and medicine suggested by Chazal. Regarding the area of pikuach nefesh, that was the second phase of my response. When Chazal says something is pikuach nefesh, and we could explain things have changed, they were right at their day and age, but things have changed, we follow present-day protocol. If we have no explanation that things have changed, we follow the Gemara and we follow the Shulchan Aruch.
Our next question pertains to yichud. Is there yichud in a patient room? Obviously, the provider and the patient being of opposite gender. And what about an x-ray room? Again, where you have the x-ray technician is opposite gender of the patient. Oh.
Explain what the question is.
So in halacha, it is a prohibition for a male and a female to be together in a room when it's only the two of them. And that is a precaution which is so important. So for some people, it would be difficult to understand. He's a decent man. She's a decent woman. Why cannot they lock themselves in a room? But that is a precaution of the Torah, a precaution of Chazal. Be careful, steer clear of spiritual danger. So it is a prohibition for a male and a female who are not married to lock themselves into the same room. What is the halacha when the door is closed, but it is not locked? So in the first volume of Shalas Teshuvas Minchas Osher, the first volume of my response and my tshuvas, I made it clear that, well, it is a reasonable chumrah not to close the door, but by fundamental halacha criteria. As long as the door is not locked and anybody could just open the door, there is no issur of yichud. There would be no prohibition of yichud. And because it is unreasonable when a doctor is treating a patient or examining a patient to leave the door open, and the door should be closed as long as it is not locked and people could enter the room, that would not be considered halachically by halachic criteria as yichud. And I think that is the proper practice to follow. A door should not be locked. And especially in today's day and age, I think many doctors would feel uncomfortable locking themselves into a room with a female, or the other way around, a female doctor with a male. And doctors are also afraid. You can never know what will come out when you're in a room with the opposite gender and you lock yourself in. Some strange people might file allegations. So I think the proper conduct is, if you need to close the door, you could close the door, but the door should not be locked. There should be a possibility from people opening the door, either swapping their card or coming into the room without the door needing to be opened from the inside. And in that case, there would be no issur of yichud.
A pre-viable pregnancy, let's say about 22 weeks, with the mother carrying a fetus, ruptures in the membranes is now at risk for the severe infection, and the baby is pre-viable. Does halacha mandate trying to save the baby while putting the mother's life at risk?
The mother's life would always have priority over the baby's life, and that is a Mishnah in Masechet Ohalos. I wasn't asked this question by a Christian, but by a good Jew. And our halacha is more lenient than some other religions. So the mother's life always has precedence over the baby's life. And in every case where it is either the mother or the fetus, the mother's life will come first. Many times I was asked, so the baby will need to be delivered with a C-section. And the mother, for any reason, doesn't want this baby. It might be a Down syndrome baby or some baby that has some other compromise. Is this an argument? C-section is surgery. Surgery is risk. So would we terminate a pregnancy that the woman should not need to have a C-section? No, that would not be acceptable, because a C-section, every surgical procedure has a certain level of risk, but it is a very remote risk, and therefore avoiding or preventing an operation, a C-section, would not be a legitimate concern terminating a pregnancy. But if a mother's life is really at danger, then the mother's life will always have precedence over the baby's life. And I've been asked similar questions hundreds of times, and maybe even more. And many times a mother's life is at risk, but Noshim Tzidkuniyos, the Jewish mother, and the mother does not want to terminate the pregnancy, even though if that pregnancy endangers her life. Imminent danger, serious danger, and I need to convince the woman, your life comes first. And your life is not yours to compromise. Your life is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's. So when we need to choose fetus over our mother, the mother's life will always have precedence.
Our next question pertains...
One of the painful manifestations of this, and I've had this many times, when cancer is discovered in a woman in an early stage of pregnancy, and the doctors say we can't treat a pregnant woman with chemotherapy or other forms of treatment. And the only way to treat the mother would be to terminate the pregnancy. And my psak in these cases is to terminate the pregnancy to give the mother a better chance of survival.
Our next question pertains to financial status. Is there a concept of overachieving, overdoing hishtadlus, or does one have to say, as it says in Ethics of Fathers, Mishnah and Pirkei Avos, Ezo Usher Hasameach Bechelkai, who is rich? He who is happy or satisfied with what he has.
So many times I apologize in halacha. There are things that are impossible clearly to quantify or define. How much hishtadlus is required? Do I need to translate hishtadlus? How much effort is required in providing for your family? On one hand, we teach emunah and betochen, and we believe that a Kadosh Baruch Hu cares for every living creature. Needless to say, every human being. Needless to say, every Jewish person. So if we believe that a Kadosh Baruch Hu cares and provides for us all, but ein soimchem ala nes, we need to do hishtadlus in medicine, in parnasa, in war, in every human endeavor. Our world is a world of cause and effect, so one needs to work to provide for his family. How much hishtadlus is required? How could one define and quantify hishtadlus? So it depends on the strength of your amunah. But let's not overestimate and exaggerate our midas habetochen. So there's a Hasidic Maisa. It's Motzei Shabbos, and Hasidim have the minig. Motzei Shabbos, you need to tell a Hasidic story. So a Hasidic story, but it's relevant to the question. So did you all hear of Reb Zusha Mahanipoli? Reb Zusha Mahanipoli was a brother of the great Rabbi Elimelech Melezhensk, of the Noam Elimelech. And once he was sitting with his Hasidim in the shtibel, and they were learning and davening Yom and Valayla, and they had nothing to eat, and they were going hungry for days. And the Hasidim plead with their great Rebbe. 2 blocks away, there was a woman, her name was Tomarel, and she was rich, and she provided for the Hasidim in town. So the Hasidim plead with Reb Zusha, we need to ask this lady, Tomarel, she should send food. And Reb Zusha insisted, Kadosh Baruch Hu watches over us. But he had a soft heart. So he said, okay. He put on his kaftan, and he walks out to the street, goes to the home of this Tamar. He walks up to the door, touches the doorknob, and he turns around, and he's on his way back. And the Hasidim say, Rebbe, you did nothing. You didn't ring the doorbell. You didn't knock on the door. How do you expect her to know that somebody was on the other side of the door? Obviously, that lady didn't have a surveillance camera on her desk. 15 minutes later, Tomarel comes to the Besmedish just randomly and asks, how are things going? Do you have food? She sees there's nothing in the fridge, so she sent a truckload of supplies. Reb Zusha said, that is the maximum hishtadlus I was willing to do. But that was Reb Zusha Mahanipoli. So there's a Gemara Nided of Einom et Beis. Shalu Anshe Alexandria Shel Mitzrayim et Rabbi Shua ben Hanania. That was a very interesting encounter between people from Alexandria and one of the greatest Tanoim, Rabbi Shua ben Hanania. And they asked 10 questions, some silly questions and some wise questions. Not I say they were silly questions. The Gemara says, Divrei Beirus, Divrei Chochma. They asked, how could one achieve wisdom? And he says, Yarbe b'yeshiva, Yamayid b'schoira, v'yavakesh mamisha chochme shelo. Learn a lot, do a little business, and pray to a Kodesh Baruch Hu to give you wisdom. Then they asked, Maya adam v'yashir. How could one achieve wealth? And he says, Yarbe b'schoira, yisa v'yitem b'yamuno. Do a lot of business. Be honest in all your business dealings with integrity and pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Gaon, the Vilna Gaon, strikes out 2 words. Check it in Bavli Einom et Beis. He strikes out Yarbe b'schoira. Ma pitom Yarbe b'schoira. Why is that required? Yeso v'yitin be'amuna v'yavakesh mamisha chochme shaloi. So the Vilna Gaon, from his perspective, no need to be marbe b'schoira. So let me say my terminology. When I am asked, what is the balance between betochen and ishtadlus? I say, when you're successful, don't become arrogant. And when things are rough, don't despair. Don't despair. Stay clear from the two polars, from the two extremes. When things go good, don't become arrogant and don't be proud. Don't think it's your koyach, it's your wisdom, I'm the greatest. You shouldn't commit the sin of koichi v'oitzim yodi osu li esachayel ezeh. Remember, Hashem Elokecha hu anoisen l'cho koyach l'asas chayel. And when things go rough, don't despair. Do your ishtadlus, daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The key is reasonability. Don't go overboard. Do normal hishtadlus. And if things are rough, give tzedakah, pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and things will get better.
The next question pertains to chinuch, child rearing. What guidance can the Rav give us with regard to chinuch with a Down syndrome child or a special needs child?
I'm happy that you raised this question because I wrote a tshuva in Minchas Osher, which contains a big chiddush. One of the most difficult areas in halacha is how to define the concept of a shoita. Now, using the word shoita is somewhat degrading or embarrassing, but that is halachic terminology. A shoita potam in a mitzvahs, a person that has limited mental capacity is exempt from mitzvahs. Is there a mitzvahs chinuch with a child who, when he grows up, will be defined as a shoita? First of all, it is one of the most complicated sugis because we have very limited sources. And what Chazal describe seemed to be a deranged person and not a retarded person. Only the Rambam in Hilchos Eidish describes a petty. So it is extremely difficult to define what is the level of cognizance or mental capacity required to be obliged to perform all the mitzvahs. I am very lenient on this matter because I think it's so important to have our kids feel accepted, feel up to par, and for a bar mitzvah kid to have an aliyah l'Torah on his bar mitzvah, the Shabbos of first mitzvah, is so important. And because when a person has aliyah l'Torah, is not moitzi anyone, he says his brochas, I am very lenient. The big problem comes when it comes to zimun in the family. So it's the father and one older son. And then number two is a special needs child, whether it's Down syndrome or another syndrome or whatever it is. And now there are three people over bar mitzvah. Do you say zimun or not? I say, of course you could say zimun. Because our minig, the mezamen, is not moitzi anyone with a bracha. So he says, Baruch shochalnu mishalo. So what? If we have 10, he would say, Nevorach Elokeinu shechalnu mishalo. So what? So what? That's not an aveda. So could it be oivel lefnei hateva? The shliach tzibur isn't moitzi anyone either. So I am very lenient in these matters because it is difficult to define. But what I wrote in the tshuva is a big chiddush, and I say, mitzvahs chinuch is min haTorah, not midarabonon. So I'm saying alam de chiddush now. I hope everybody in the audience will understand. We all know the Gemara that chinuch is midarabonon, and I say chinuch is min haTorah. How do we know that parents have a biblical obligation to be mechanech their children? And why is it not a mitzvah to say, Ki yudativ lamana sheyetzav abonai v'beis Yaakov? Rashi writes, Ki yudativ is a loshen ahavo. Kodesh Baruch Hu says, I love Avraham. Why does a Kodesh Baruch Hu love Avraham? Obviously, he has many reasons to love Avraham. עשור הניסיונס נכנס אברהם אבינו ועמד בכולם. אברהם אבינו קיים כל התורה כולה עד שלא ניתנו. But those are not the reasons HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves Avraham. למען שיצא ועזבונה וביסו אחרו ושמרו דרך השם. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I love Avraham because he passed on to the next generation what he learned. V'shamru derech Hashem. When we say Chinuch D'Rabbanan, it means Chachomim dictate din koton kedin godol. Yodea lenanea, chayev and lulav. He keeps a clean body, chayev b'tfilin. That's the Rabbanan. But Minat Torah, not only the father but mother as well. Not only your sons, your daughters as well. Everybody is mechuyev to teach every child, regardless of his mental capacity. You teach him what he could perform. HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves them all, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to be loved by them all. If you could teach your child just to say Shema Yisrael, you need to do that. If that is too much for him, if you could teach him to believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you need to do that. If you could teach him to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants you to do. So, some children, or special needs children with limited mental capacity, you can't teach them to perform all the mitzvahs, but whatever you could teach them, you are obliged to do so. So the mitzvahs chinuch, which is Minat Torah, pertains to every child. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects each and every one of us to serve him with the tools HaKadosh Baruch Hu provided that person to serve him in his limited capacity.
At this point, we're going to accept questions from the general public. The protocol and rules of engagement are a question. We're not looking for you to share your political views at this point in time. That could be over Malav Malka. A specific question, a pointed question, without being long-winded.
And I take the liberty, I might say, this is a question I would like to discuss in another forum.
I'm Dr. Nochem, Idish pediatrician, 38 years, Lakewood, New Jersey. A lot of questions. One question, I have to leave the others out. What rights do parents have, or do they have rights to refuse medical treatment which is against medical advice? And the question of informed consent by people who cannot possibly understand, have the background, the tools to appreciate risks and benefits.
By the nature of things, the ones who decide how to treat children are their parents, assuming that parents will care about their children in a sensible manner. A parent has no right to deprive his child of needed medical treatment. The problem is, by the nature of things, parents have authority over their children. And that is such a simple assumption. It's a natural assumption that doesn't really need to have any sources in halacha. Who will decide to treat a child? His neighbors, his friends in school? His parents are the one. But parents need to know their children are not their possession. Our children are not our possession. Our children are a sacred trust that HaKadosh Baruch Hu entrusted in our hands. So if you ask whether parents have a right to deny treatment from their children, of course they have no right. The question is the practicality. And it is very disturbing. And we spoke about this in our first session, about vaccination. It is very disturbing that in such a large segment of our community, people deny medicine. They deny medical knowledge, and they believe in strange things that have no scientific basis. But that is a fact of life. We need to try to educate people. We don't have the means. It is only in extreme cases, and we have this in Shlit Tzedek in the hospital and other hospitals throughout the world. You know, I was involved in a case in which a pregnancy was high risk, and the doctors say if we don't operate immediately, the fetus will die and the mother's life will be in danger. And she asked someone that said, no, do not operate, and he gave a bracha, and the hospital convened the ethics committee, and in Israel you need a judge to sign off. And the judge signed off, this woman should be operated on without her consent. But that is a very extreme case, because by the nature of things, the one to decide how to treat the child would be the parents. So the only way we could deal with this is educating people, and educating leaders and teachers and rabbonim that we have no other choice but to follow mainstream medicine. And I want to go back to an issue we discussed briefly in our first session about vaccinations. So even here, some people approach me, some doctors approach me saying, but everything is driven by money and everything is driven by interests and the high, the pharmaceutical industries that have billions of dollars control everything. This is not a perfect world, and we're aware of that. It's not a perfect world. And even with the best of intentions, there were many cases in which medicines, after decades, were proven to have very bad negative effects. So there's a halachic concept that we find in various sources in Shas, Yevamos Yud Beis, Yevamos Ayin Beis, Shabbos Kuf Chof Tes, Shoyme Pesoim Hashem. So if you follow mainstream medical advice, even though there might be mistakes, but you are relatively safe, because the Pasuk says, that's a Pasuk in Mishlei, Shoyme Pesoim Hashem. You do what you can do. There are things that are beyond your means and beyond your knowledge. But if you follow mainstream medical opinions, then you could rely on the Pasuk Shomer Pesoim Hashem. But just following crazy ideas and insanity and people that just defy science and defy medicine is a very bad proposition. So all we could do is just try to educate people to understand that doctors in general and the medical establishment is not here to kill us, and they're here to save lives. As in any other human endeavor, we could all make mistakes. Commanders make mistakes, doctors make mistakes, even rabbonim sometimes could make mistakes. Human beings make mistakes, as David HaMelech says in Tehillim, Shkiyois miyovin. But there is no other way al pi Torah but to follow mainstream medical advice.
Question? When it comes to preventative medicine.
I'll repeat the question. You can ask. I'll repeat the question.
For those of us who are physicians in rare specialties where there aren't that many of us, what's the right hashgacha in finding the balance between giving time to seeing patients and seeing more patients and helping them versus protecting time for ourselves and our families?
This is one additional question which one cannot quantify. But every person needs to have enough time for his family and his children. Whether you're a teacher of Torah, whether you're a medical profession. And somebody recently asked me, is it true that I gave a psak, if you're not going to be a magachir, you need to be a doctor? And I said, I usually don't give silly psokim. And that would be a silly psak. But I do say that the next best and most important profession, if you're not teaching Torah, would be to be a doctor. Because when you teach Torah, you're giving away your resources, your energy, your time, and your nefesh for the most important endeavor. And when you're a doctor, you're giving your resources, time, and energy to, maybe I would say, the second most important endeavor, or maybe it compares to the first. So treating patients is a huge mitzvah. In many cases, it is atzolas nefoshes, and in all cases, it is alleviating pain and making people better. But you need to set apart time from your family. So my family knows, I once said a word, Hai alma kebehilu ledamya. Life is like a wedding. In what way? And I say life is like a Hasidic chasana. Did you ever attend a Hasidic wedding? It starts 4:30 in the afternoon at Kabbalas Ponim, an hour before the chuppah. The friends of the chosen come together, and they sing Shirei Neshama. And who's going to be there for you 4:30 in the afternoon? Who's going to leave his kotel, his business, his job, his office? Your siblings, all your children, some of your siblings, your closest friends. 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. If you're wealthy, if you're famous, if you're a person of affluence, there are going to be hundreds of people there. 3:30 in the morning at the end of the mitzvah dance, who's going to be there for you? Who's going to stay up till 4 o'clock in the morning for you? Your siblings, some of them, your kids, and that's a moshel about life. You're at your prime, you're powerful, you're wealthy, people are knocking at your door. 4 o'clock in the morning, no one is going to be there. Your kids, your family, don't forget that. So never neglect your family. And your family needs you most. And your biggest mitzvah is caring for your children, spiritually, physically. So a doctor or a teacher of Torah, you always need to have enough time for your family. So the Chassam Sofer had hundreds of Talmidim. One of his Talmidim was Rabbi Avram Orenstein, and he wrote a sefer Divrei Avraham. And he writes an interesting story in his introduction. He writes, my great Rebbe, the Chassam Sofer, once complained to me, I'm so busy with the yeshiva, I'm so busy with the kehillah, I don't have enough time for my children. My son Shimon, ultimately he was to be Reb Shimon Sofer, one of the greatest gedolim of his era. My son Shimon, I don't even know what he's learning. That's what the Chassam Sofer complained. I felt his pain, writes the Divrei Avraham. So I shared with him a pshat. I said in a posuk in Tehillim, Kol hayom choinen umalva v'zaroi levrocha. I said a strange pshat. I said the posuk refers to people that give away their days and nights for chinuch. Kol hayom choinen umalva. Those that give away their days to HaKadosh Baruch Hu blesses them, v'zaroi lebrocha. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you care for my kinderlach, I'll care for yours. So all those doctors, maybe like the one that asked the question, and all those teachers that are so busy caring for people, they don't have enough time for their family. My bracha to them is v'zaroi lebrocha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will watch over your kinderlach, and you should have a lot of nachas. But one needs to set aside time for his family.
Apologize about this before. When it comes to preventative medicine, for example, it's recommended to undergo colonoscopy at certain ages, at certain frequencies. Someone came to me and asked me, he made a cheshbon that he doesn't have any family issues, and going through colonoscopy involves anesthesia and a procedure, and although it's minimal risk, why not sheb ve'al ta'aseh adif?
Why not?
Sheb ve'al ta'aseh adif.
I recently signed a letter encouraging people to take periodical testing. It's 5 years since I had my last colonoscopy, and I scheduled one as I come home. I think it is extremely important. Early detection saves lives. And I don't think you need to be overly anxious and test every available tests, but follow doctor's instructions. And at a certain age, you should start testing. Colon cancer always is preventable. It starts with a polyp that could be easily removed. And that is why doctors suggest if you're over 50, I don't know exactly what age it starts, you should test. And many other things. Early detection saves lives. So I definitely encourage people, follow your doctor's orders and do periodical tests. I won't go into details exactly what. I'm not a doctor. But in principle, it is always better to prevent illness, and I said this Friday. It is always better to prevent illness than to treat illness. It is always safer to prevent cancer than to treat cancer. So I strongly encourage everyone to do periodic testing. I know that some Gedolim said, better not to know. As long as you don't know, then you're well. I don't think so. And many times we discover cancer or other illnesses when it is tragically too late to treat. And then we have regrets. Why didn't I test earlier?
Next question came from the website. I'm a doctor that sees patients back to back, and in the winter I sometimes have trouble with mincha. When do we invoke the concept of osik b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah? He who is busy with a mitzvah, a good deed, at that point is therefore exempt from another mitzvah.
A doctor treating patients is potter from davening, but one should definitely structure his day in a way he should be able to daven 3 times a day, preferably with minyan. So coincidental. You're seeing patients and the overload is greater than you thought. You had to spend more time with a patient. If you're treating patients, osik b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah. But a person should structure his day in a way that avodas Hashem should be an integral and essential part of his routine. So I think a doctor should structure his day in a way that he should be able to daven mincha, and preferably with a tzibur, with a minyan. An inspiration I have from visiting America, and almost every office building I would visit, they have onboard minyanim. So people are busy with their activities, with their businesses, but it's built in to their Seder Hayom, to their routine, to be able to daven with a minyan. And I think in every profession, that is what should be strongly recommended. Osik b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah is a concept which should be executed coincidentally, not on a steady basis. On a steady basis, one should structure his day in a way that he should be able to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the fullest sense, and daven preferably with a minyan 3 times a day. But if it happens to be and you're treating patients, you're potter from davening.
My name is Yossi Jared, I'm a neurologist. In earlier discussions, the Rav was mentioning the risk-benefit analysis of the childhood vaccines and why the benefit is so much more than the trivial risk, but the risks are not zero. As we follow the COVID vaccine, the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth vaccine, where the marginal benefit becomes smaller and the risk is not as clearly defined because we don't have the data, what would the Rav feel about getting a 6th or subsequent COVID vaccine? And what has the Rav done personally, if I may ask?
I just a moment ago shared some personal information, and I already come to regret it. When I speak so forcefully about vaccines, I primarily mean the accepted vaccines for children. These vaccines came to prevent horrific illness. Some of these ailments were totally eradicated. We know no smallpox. But some, if we let down our guard will come back with a vengeance, like measles, and kids will die. And it already happened a few years ago in Yerushalayim. A few children died from measles. And the consequences are horrific even when they do survive. I do not have the same approach with the flu vaccine, for instance. The flu, by far and large, is a mild illness. Yes, there are many documented cases of people dying from the flu, but statistically they are very, very few. And the flu vaccine is not the most effective of vaccines. And experts vary whether it's 30% or 40%, because the flu is a very fluid disease, and it changes, it morphs. And therefore, usually we develop the vaccine based on the previous strain, which is not always relevant to a new one. So I would not say it is an obligation or a chiyuv to vaccinate. Doctors strongly encourage it. So a very good friend of mine took a flu vaccine, and he was out for a week, and he felt worse than probably he would feel if he had the illness. So I think it is recommended, but I wouldn't go beyond that. And COVID, we all remember those very challenging times almost 5 years ago when people were dying daily, and the agmas nefesh we had, even in that period when the vaccine became available from anti-vaxxers and people were still dying. I think COVID today is somewhat similar to the flu, and the recent strains are not very, very horrific. So I would not go to the extent of saying it's a chiyuv, it's an obligation to vaccinate. Probably it should be recommended, but I can't say more than that.
How should one go about balancing kibbud aim with the health of a child if one's parent is a heavy smoker and you want to limit or completely restrict their access to a newborn child?
This is a very common question in different scenarios. Sometimes there are abusive parents, and a son or a daughter feels that to his benefit or his wife's benefit or the well-being of his family, he needs to limit friction with his parents. So on one hand, kibbud avim is one of the aseres adibris. We read today the aseres adibris. And Chazal go to the extreme, describing the importance of this mitzvah. Hukash kvoidam lekvoid hamokoim. But many times I gave a psak, your well-being and the well-being of your family come first. Always be respectful. Never act in a nasty fashion to your parents. Never raise your voice. But you are entitled to stay away if that is necessary for the well-being, mentally, emotionally, of you or your family members. And this is a very common question. However, not always does a person have the right judgment when he thinks that my parents are to blame, and that's why I'm going to stay away. And sometimes this is very painful to parents. And because in halacha we have the concept of a negea b'davar, you might be biased. And therefore, I always recommend to our people, discuss it with your Rav, discuss the situation with the Talmid Chacham, who is not emotionally involved. But if a professional or a Rav really supports your feeling that you need to limit your kesher with a parent, and that is to the well-being of your family, that comes before. So is there a mitzvah to care for the well-being of your family? Which mitzvah is that? Where do we find it? V'yahavta l'reacha kamocha doesn't put your family before others. But it is nature it is natural. As we said in response to a previous shaila, who is the one to decide how to treat his children? And therefore, if you think your relationship with a parent is detrimental and it's harming your family and the well-being of your family, that comes first. So maybe you are entitled to limit exposure, but there's a concept of moire avem, and try never to embarrass, to hurt, to raise your voice, or to act in a disrespectful fashion to a parent.
This will be the last question for the evening, prior to Malava Malka, as I'm sure some may be hungry.
Achron Chovev, see to it that it's a good question.
No pressure. Can one be Yotze Targum using other Mefarshim on the Torah besides for Rashi?
That's all?
That's all?
But I was mistaken. There is actually two more a session after this. We have at 9:20. There are two sessions, which is on the schedule.
One cannot be Yotze Shnai Mikaveh Echad Targum with any other commentator. Even Rashi is questionable because Rashi doesn't explain every posuk. So it is preferable to actually use Targum. And to perform this mitzvah in its wholest, one should familiarize himself with the lashon of Targum. Because on one hand, it is about understanding Mikra. And that is why many poskim suggest Rashi. But Rashi is only partial. He doesn't explain every posuk. So the most suggested form would be to familiarize yourself with Targum and be makayim the mitzvah shnai mikra ve'echod Targum. One more, okay?
We just got a great question. This might take some time with regard to trading hostages for terrorists.
That is a great question, but nobody in the audience tonight will need to make that decision. I recently gave a shiur about this, and to some people it would be disturbing to hear that not every question could be decided by Gedolim or by Poskim. We are supposed to teach the fundamental ethics. But this is a question that must be decided by political people and by military people. And what I just said, I could give a long shiur about this. But this question came up many times. Since Israel was born, we've been dealing with this question again and again and again. In 1970, terrorists landed two, I think it was Air France planes, and they were taken from one place to the other, and finally ended up in Jordan, in Zarqa. One of the captives on those planes was Rabbi Sekutner, one of the greatest Gedolim. And at the time, some of his Talmidim wanted to raise a lot of money, first of all, to get him out. Because Tosfos twice in Gittin, Memhei and Nun Ches says, a great Talmud Chacham, we pay any price. Rabbi Yankov Kamenetsky Zatzal opposed that, and rightfully so. It would be a huge Chilul Hashem if we would free Rabbi Sekutner and let all the others to their fate. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein wrote a letter, and I have a copy of the letter. It's cute, it's amusing. It's a letter to Golda Meir, who was prime minister at the time, typed with a typewriter with the corrections. And that was the way things were done. You know, it was 55 years ago, in 1970. And I have a picture of that letter. It's not that Moshe's blank, there's no letterhead. And there are about 5 or 6 corrections in that letter that the Moshe wrote to Golda Meir. And he encouraged her to make the right decision, and if need be, to release terrorists. Entebbe, fast forward to Entebbe. Orches Rabbeinu is a sefer about the Stipler, and Rabbi Avram Horowitz is considered the most reliable source about the Stipler. And in the second volume, he writes, I asked my Rebbe, the Stipler, what should the government do? And he said they should release terrorists to bring the people home, but if they decide to use military force, they're entitled to do so. And then the other day, he says, I told him the Israeli army released those hostages. And he expressed simcha, and he said, only the Jews could do that. He wasn't afraid to praise the Israeli army, and interesting. And he said, only the Israeli army could do such a thing. And the third source is Yabia Omer Chelik Yud, and Rav Ovadia. As Rav Ovadia, he has a 10-page tshuva quoting about 500 sources. I didn't count how many. And he writes that Yitzhak Rabin asked our opinion. He was prime minister at the time. And we brought 8 Rabbonim together. Maronan v'Rabbonan, Reb Shlomo Zalman, Rav Elyoshev, Reb Tzion Abba Shaul, Reb Eliezer Goldschmidt, and Reb Tzalel Zolti, and Reb Shaul Yisraeli. And we dealt with this matter, and we decided to tell the prime minister, whatever you decide, which will be the best for the country, either a military raid or releasing terrorists would be legitimate. And Rabbi Ovadia writes, then we got a call from the prime minister that there was a military raid and they're on their way home. And Rabbi Ovadia the Posek suddenly becomes Rabbi Ovadia the poet. And he writes 5 lines thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu and thanking the military for conducting this raid. And I firmly, who am I to give my haskama? But this was Reb Moshe, the Stipler, and about 10 Gedolim who came together. This is a question that has nothing to do with all our sources. Once upon a time, Jews were taken into custody for money. And it was like negotiating a deal. If you don't pay, they'll let down the price. If they don't get the money, maybe it's not a profitable proposition. We're dealing with a state. We're dealing with a nation. We're dealing with an army. It's a different entity. It's a different situation. It's not about money. And therefore, we could only share the spirit of Torah and the importance of Pikuach Nefesh, but the ultimate decision must be made by political forces and by military considerations, as all the Gedolim previously paskined. So I still have one shir tomorrow, but it was a pleasure to spend this beautiful Shabbos together with all of you and to share Torah. And a special thank you for Dr. Friedman for putting all this together.